The cry came once, and then it was gone. Nora Vass stood very still on the slope, with her hand on the rifle, and listened to the place where the sound had been. The wind had dropped. The scrub oaks along the lower ridge were motionless. Below her, the dry creek bed ran like a pale scar through the red earth, waterless and silent. Above her, the ridge itself cut a sharp line against the late afternoon sky. Nothing moving along it, nothing visible, nothing that could have made a sound like that and then taken it back. She waited. The sound had been human. She was certain of that. Not a coyote, not a hawk, not the particular cry a rabbit makes when something catches it in the dark. It had the shape of a word inside it, not a word she could name, but the intention of one, the reaching quality of a voice that needs to be heard. She waited another full minute, counting her own heartbeats. Nothing. She looked back down the slope toward the camp where the mule was tied to the lower juniper and the fire was banked low enough that its smoke was nearly invisible in the late afternoon haze. Everything down there was as she had left it. The mule stood with its head low, ears loose, the posture of an animal at rest. That was something. A mule reads country the way a careful person reads a room. Nothing in its behavior suggested alarm. She looked back up at the ridge. The cry had come from up there, or from just beyond it. Sound carried strangely in these canyons, bouncing off the red rock faces and arriving at angles that had nothing to do with where the source actually stood. She had learned this the hard way 2 years ago in the Mogollon Rim, when she'd spent half a morning tracking a sound that turned out to be half a mile in the opposite direction from where she'd been walking. But this sound had not echoed. It had arrived clean and direct from the ridge above, and it had stopped before it could be mistaken for anything else. She made a decision. She began climbing.
Her name was Nora Voss, and she was 31 years old, and she had been moving through this particular stretch of Arizona territory for 11 days alone. She was not lost. That was the first thing people assumed about a woman alone in this country, and it was the assumption she was least inclined to correct, because a person underestimated is a person with a certain kind of advantage. She carried a surveyor's compass she'd learned to read from her father, a rifle she'd learned to shoot from necessity, and a canvas journal in which she recorded water sources, trail conditions, and the locations of abandoned structures that the land company she worked for might find useful in the coming season's assessments. She was a field recorder. It was not a common profession for a woman in 1883, and she had not arrived at it through any conventional route. She had arrived at it the way most people arrive at the lives they actually live, through a series of circumstances that seemed unrelated at the time and only made sense in retrospect. A father who treated her the same as her brothers, a husband who died of fever in the 3rd year of their marriage, a land company agent in Prescott who had been desperate enough for reliable field work that he had overlooked the obvious objection and hired her on a trial basis 3 years ago. She had not given him cause to regret it. The territory she was currently working was a broken stretch of canyon country southeast of the Mazet-Sol Range, a landscape of red rock and juniper and dry arroyos that folded into each other in complex patterns that defeated most casual travelers and rewarded the patient and systematic. She had been mapping water sources and recording trail grades for 8 days when she'd found the old homestead in the canyon bottom, which changed her route and her timeline both. The homestead was the reason she was still here. The homestead was, in a way that she was only beginning to understand, the reason for everything that followed.
She had found it on the 9th morning, moving along the west wall of the lower canyon, where a game trail ran above the creek bed and the footing was better than the sandy floor. It appeared from around a bend in the canyon wall, first a corner of stone foundation, then the collapsed remains of an adobe wall, then what had once been a doorway opening onto a packed dirt yard, now reclaimed by dry grass and creosote. The roof was long gone. The walls stood to about 4 feet on the north and east sides and had fallen entirely on the south, leaving only the foundation line visible in the earth. She would have noted it and moved on. Abandoned structures were common in this country, the evidence of ambitions that had not survived the land's arithmetic, except for two things. The first was the well. It was in the northeast corner of the yard, covered with a wooden lid that was not rotted. Not new, but not rotted, treated with something, pine pitch perhaps, and replaced within the last few years by someone who knew what they were doing. She lifted the lid and lowered her hand inside, and felt cold air rising from below, which meant water, and when she dropped a pebble, she heard the small, distant sound of it entering water perhaps 30 feet down. A maintained well in an abandoned homestead meant someone still used it. Maybe a rancher from the upper valley who ran cattle through the canyon in the dry months. Maybe travelers who knew the route. Maybe any number of things, but it meant the place was not as abandoned as it appeared. The second thing was the journal. It was in what had once been a small storage room off the main space, a low adobe box with 3 standing walls, the roof gone, the floor covered in a thin layer of blown-in soil and dried leaves. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth and wedged into a gap in the north wall at about knee-height, the kind of place you'd choose if you wanted something to stay dry and stay hidden. She should not have taken it. She knew this even as she unwrapped it and opened the cover. The oilcloth was relatively recent, not new, but recent enough that the journal inside was in readable condition. The first entry was dated 14 months ago. The handwriting was a man's, large, slightly uneven, the writing of someone who wrote infrequently and with effort. She read the first 3 pages standing in the roofless storage room with the afternoon light coming straight down and the canyon walls red and still on both sides. By the time she finished the 3rd page, she had sat down on the adobe foundation and read 6 more. The journal belonged to a man named Harlan Crew. He had been living in this canyon, not at the homestead, but somewhere nearby, somewhere he did not name specifically, for what appeared to be the better part of a year. The entries were irregular and sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks. They described the canyon, the water, the game. They described loneliness in the particular understated way that men of that era described it, obliquely, through the recording of small observations, the way a person marks the thing they cannot say directly by circling it in careful language. But they also described other things. In the 7th entry, Crew wrote about riders he had seen on the upper rim, 4 men, moving south, leading a 5th horse with something on it that he could not identify from the distance. He wrote that he had watched them for 2 hours and they had not come down into the canyon. In the 9th entry, he wrote about finding a camp near the South Arroyo that was not his camp. A fire ring, recently used, boot prints in the dry soil around it, several sets. He wrote that he had not gone back to that arroyo after that. In the 12th entry, which was dated 6 weeks ago, he wrote, "They know the canyon now the way I know it. I think they have been watching me learn it." The journal ended there. Not at the bottom of a page, mid-page, mid-thought, as if the writing had simply stopped. She had sat with that for a long time. Then she wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth, but she put it in her own pack, which she knew was not right, and she told herself she would return it when she found the man who had left it, and she walked back to her camp and spent that evening reading the remaining entries again by firelight, building a picture of a man in a specific kind of trouble. She had been planning to leave the canyon the following morning. She was still here 2 days later. The ridge above her was steeper than it had appeared from below. She climbed carefully, using both hands on the loose shale sections, keeping the rifle slung across her back where it wouldn't catch on the rock. The light was still good, perhaps 2 hours before dark, but the canyon below was already in shadow, the red walls dimming to purple as the sun dropped behind the western rim. Above her, the ridgeline was still in direct light, gold and sharp. She was perhaps 40 feet below the crest when she heard the second sound. It was behind her. She stopped climbing. She did not turn immediately. She pressed herself against the rock face and listened to the space behind and below her, the slope she had just climbed, the canyon floor far below, the scrub oaks along the lower ledges. Silence. But not the same silence as before. Before, the silence had been an absence. This silence had a presence to it, the particular quality that air takes on when something living is in it and not moving. She turned slowly, keeping her back against the rock. The slope below her was empty. The scrub oaks were still. The canyon floor was shadow and pale creek bed in the dark shape of her camp 200 yards below, the mule now with its head up and its ears forward, looking at something she could not see from this height. The mule's ears were the fact that mattered. She looked for another 30 seconds, scanning the slope in slow sections the way her father had taught her to look at country, not searching for a shape, but watching for movement, which is a different kind of looking and requires a different kind of stillness in the looker. Nothing moved. She resumed climbing, faster now, though she kept it controlled. She reached the ridgeline and came over it low, staying below the skyline, and looked at what was on the other side. A shallow bowl of rock and juniper, perhaps 200 feet across, dropping away to a second canyon beyond. In the near center of the bowl, a man. He was on the ground, sitting, not lying, his back against a large, flat boulder, legs extended. He was holding his left arm against his chest with his right hand, and even from 40 feet away she could see that something was wrong with the arm. He was looking directly at her.
He was young, 25 at most, perhaps younger. His face was pale beneath the tan of a man who worked outdoors, and pale in the wrong way, the pallor of pain and blood loss rather than the pallor of cold. His hat was gone. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder and dark with blood that had dried to near black at the edges and was still wet at the center. He did not speak when she came over the ridge. He only watched her. She stayed low and moved to her right along the ridgeline, putting a boulder between herself and the open bowl, and looked at the surrounding terrain before she went to him. The far canyon beyond the bowl, the rim above, the juniper thickets to the south and north. Nothing moved. No horses visible. No other people. She went to him. "Your arm," she said. "Shoulder," he said. His voice was controlled but thin. Something came apart in it. "I don't think it's the bone." "How long have you been here?" "Since this morning." She crouched beside him and looked at the shoulder without touching it yet. The shirt was torn, and she could see the wound beneath, a deep laceration, not a bullet hole, the edges of it ragged and pulled apart. A fall, she thought, rock or shale edge, the kind of cut that opens wide and bleeds long. "Can you walk?" she asked. "I could before," he said. "I'm not sure now." "What is your name?" He looked at her for a moment before answering, the way people look when they are deciding how much a name costs to give. "Rue," he said. "Elias Rue." She looked at him carefully. "Do you know a man named Harlan Crew?" Something moved in his face, not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of something he had been expecting. "He's my uncle," he said. She got him down the slope in the last of the daylight, which was slower and harder work than she had anticipated. He could walk, but the shoulder had stiffened in the hours he'd been sitting against the boulder, and any significant movement of his upper body brought a hard, involuntary sound from him that he was clearly working to suppress. She let him set the pace and did not push it, keeping herself to his downhill side on the loose sections, where a stumble would send him rolling. By the time they reached the camp, the canyon was completely dark, and the stars were coming out in a sky that had gone from purple to near black. She rebuilt the fire higher than she'd kept it the past several days. The boy needed warmth, and she needed light to work by, and she cleaned and bound the shoulder wound with the medical cloth she carried in the canvas pack, which she kept for her own purposes and now found herself grateful for in a way that felt less like gratitude and more like the recognition of a pattern. Things prepared for yourself have a way of ending up used for someone else. He told her about the shoulder while she worked. He had been on the upper rim above the bowl and had gone over a shale ledge that gave way without warning, a 4-foot drop onto the rock below, and the shoulder had taken the impact. He'd spent an hour determining that the damage was not so severe that he couldn't move, then another 3 hours sitting against the boulder waiting to be sure the men he'd seen on the rim to the north had moved on before he tried the slope. She tied the last strip of cloth and sat back. "What men?" she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. "How long have you been in this canyon?" 11 days, she said. "Then you've seen them." "I found your uncle's journal," she said. "I've read it." He looked at her then, not with anger, though he had cause for it, with something more like relief, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a piece of information alone and has just found someone else to share the weight of it. "Then you know what they are," he said. "I know what he thought they were," she said carefully. "I'd like to hear what you think." He looked back at the fire. "There were 5 of them," he said. "Maybe 6. He'd never gotten an accurate count because they were careful about not being seen all at once. They had been in this canyon system for at least 3 months, based on what his uncle had recorded and what Elias himself had observed in the 2 weeks since he'd come looking for Harlan. They used the abandoned homestead as a waypoint, not a camp, a waypoint, and they moved between the upper rim and the lower canyon with the knowledge of the terrain that took time to acquire. They had, as best Elias could determine, taken his uncle. Not killed, he was careful about that distinction. Taken. There had been no signs of violence at the place where Harlan had been camped, a shallow cave in the North Canyon wall, well hidden, stocked with provisions. Everything was there, the provisions, the bedding, a second journal she had not found. Only Harlan was not there.
"When did you find the camp empty?" she asked. 9 days ago, he said, "the day before I came into the lower canyon." She absorbed this. 9 days. The journal's last entry was 6 weeks ago. There was a gap of more than a month between the last words Harlan Crew had written and the moment his camp was found empty. And in that gap was everything she didn't know. "Why haven't you gone for help?" she asked. "Nearest settlement is 2 days' ride north." "I had a horse," he said. "They took the horse 4 days ago. I came back from scouting the upper rim and the horse was gone and there were boot prints around the juniper I'd tied it to." He said this without visible emotion, which told her the emotion was there and being managed carefully. "So they know you're here," she said. "They've known since the 2nd day," he said. "I'm not as good at this as my uncle was, and he wasn't good enough." She looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she looked at the darkness beyond the fire's reach, which was considerable and complete. "They haven't moved against you," she said. "No." "Why not?" He shook his head slowly. "I've been trying to work that out." She had been trying to work out the same thing since she'd read the journal, and she had a thought about it that she wasn't ready to speak yet. The thought was this: men who take someone, rather than killing them, are men who need something from the person they've taken. And men who watch a second person move through their territory for days without moving against them are men who are still deciding what that second person is worth. The question was what she was worth. The answer to that might depend heavily on what they had found in her pack on the 2 occasions when she had left camp and come back to find things subtly and unmistakably rearranged. She had not mentioned this to Elias yet. She had first noticed it 6 days ago. She'd been gone from camp for 4 hours, mapping the South Arroyo and recording 2 rock art sites she'd found on the canyon wall. When she returned, the camp was as she'd left it, fire banked, mule tied, pack against the juniper, except that the pack's outer flap was fastened 1 buckle lower than she always left it, and the folded cloth inside the top section had been moved, replaced in a slightly different orientation. Someone had gone through the pack. She had spent that evening working through the implications, with the particular calm she developed over 3 years of being alone in country that could kill her in a dozen ordinary ways. The pack contained her surveying compass, her field journal, the maps she was building, Harlan Crew's journal, her medical supplies, her provisions, and a letter of authorization from the land company on official paper with a stamped seal. She thought about that letter for a long time. A letter of authorization from a land company, with a seal, in a territory where land disputes were the texture of daily life and where a document that looked official could mean the difference between a claim that held and a claim that didn't. The second time her pack was searched was 3 days later. She had been more deliberate about leaving markers, a specific placement of a small stone on the outer flap, a thread from her shirt caught in the buckle. Both were gone when she returned. The pack had been gone through more thoroughly this time. The contents were placed with care, but not the exact care she applied, which left signs she could read. They had taken nothing. Whatever they were looking for, they either hadn't found it or hadn't decided yet what to do about finding it. She told Elias all of this that night, sitting at the fire with the dark pressing in on all sides and the mule dozing at the edge of the firelight. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The letter," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "What exactly does it authorize?" "Field assessment of unregistered land parcels in this survey district," she said, "for the purposes of commercial evaluation." He looked at her. "Which means I'm here on behalf of people who are looking at whether this canyon and the land around it has value they can put a number on and a claim to." She paused. "And anyone who's been using this canyon for 3 months and doesn't want to be found is going to read that letter and understand that they have a limited amount of time before this land has eyes on it from people with money and authority behind them. So they're not just deciding what you're worth, they're deciding what you knowing about them costs." "Yes," she said. He looked at the fire. "That's worse," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. She slept in 2-hour intervals that night, the rifle across her lap, her back against the same juniper she always camped against. Elias slept longer, the sleep of someone depleted by blood loss and pain, and she let him. She needed him mobile, and she needed him capable of decision-making, and neither of those things would happen if he pushed through the night on no rest. Between her sleep intervals, she listened to the canyon. It was not quiet. Canyons at night have their own conversation, rock cooling, small animals moving in the brush, the distant sound of something she could not identify that came from the north wall and might have been wind through a narrow gap, or might have been something else entirely. She cataloged each sound and assigned it a probability, and let the low probability ones live in the back of her attention without pulling them forward. At some point in the hour before dawn, she became aware that the mule was awake. Not alarmed, not the rigid, wide-eyed alertness of an animal that has identified a predator, but awake and oriented, its head turned toward the north wall of the canyon, ears tracking something in that direction. She watched the north wall for 20 minutes. Nothing came out of it. But when the light came up enough to see clearly, she walked the perimeter of the camp in a careful circuit and found what she had half expected to find: boot prints in the sandy soil at the north edge of the camp, perhaps 15 feet from where Elias had been sleeping. One set. Standing still, from the depth of the impression, standing and watching for some time, then withdrawing the way they'd come, back toward the north wall. Someone had stood in the dark at the edge of their firelight and looked at them. She did not tell Elias immediately. She made coffee from the grounds she had left and gave him the first cup, and watched the canyon wake up around them while she thought about what the boot prints meant and what they did not mean. They did not mean an attack was coming. An attack in the night on a sleeping camp would have been the simplest resolution, and it had not happened. Whatever calculus these men were running, immediate violence was not the answer they'd arrived at. That was information. What the prints meant was that the decision-making was accelerating. Standing 15 feet from a sleeping camp was a different act from going through a pack in an empty camp. It was closer. It was more personal. It was the behavior of people who are moving toward a conclusion. She had 2 days, she estimated. Perhaps 3. After that, whatever they had decided would become what they did. She had to find Harlan Crew before that. She told Elias over the second cup of coffee. He took it the way she was beginning to expect him to take things, quietly, with a kind of internal processing that showed in a brief stillness before he responded.
"You think my uncle is alive," he said. "I think he was alive when they took him," she said. "Men who go through packs looking for something specific are men who are trying to solve a problem, not create a body. A body creates its own set of problems in this country." "So does a witness," he said. "Yes," she said, "which is why I need to find him before they finish deciding what to do about having one." "You," he said, "not we." She looked at him. "Your shoulder needs 2 more days before you can climb or carry anything useful. You know this." He looked at his bound shoulder. He knew it. "Then what do I do?" he said. "You stay with the camp and you keep the mule calm and you give me until midday," she said. "If I'm not back by midday, you walk north. You don't run, you don't take the main canyon floor, you stay high on the east wall where the shale is, and you don't come back." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been planning this since you found the prince," he said. "I've been planning something like this since I read your uncle's journal," she said. "The prince just set the timing." She left at first light, moving north along the canyon wall on the high game trail, where the footing was rock and not sand, and she left no prints. She carried the rifle, the compass, her water skin, and Harlan Crew's journal. She carried the journal because she had been thinking about it since the night before, and she had arrived at something. The journal described a specific place in its earlier entries, a high ledge on the north rim above a place Crew called the Second Narrowing, where he had watched the riders from a distance of perhaps 300 feet. He described the ledge in enough detail that she thought she could find it, and the ledge was significant because it was the highest observable point he had mentioned, and the highest observable point was where she would go if she were holding someone in this canyon and did not want them seen from the floor.
She moved fast on the high trail, covering ground in the early morning cool, the canyon below still in deep shadow. The north wall rose beside her as she moved, red rock and juniper and the occasional dark mouth of a shallow cave. She counted the cave openings as she went, matching them against Crew's descriptions. The second narrowing was where the canyon walls pinched to perhaps 60 feet apart, the floor dropping below a series of dry waterfalls carved in the rock over centuries. She found it after 40 minutes of steady movement. The ledge Crew had described was above and to the west, a wide shelf of rock, perhaps 8 feet deep and 20 feet long, accessible from above by a sloping ramp of shale that came down from the upper rim. She did not go directly to it. She circled wide, coming around from the south, approaching the ramp from an angle that kept the rock shelf itself in her line of sight while she climbed toward it. There was a man sitting on the ledge. Not Harlan Crew, a guard, young, armed, sitting with his back against the canyon wall and his rifle across his knees, looking out over the canyon floor below. He had not heard her. He was looking the wrong direction, watching the trail she had not taken. She backed off the ramp and pressed herself into the shadow of a juniper thicket and thought. A guard on the ledge meant something worth guarding was nearby. The ledge itself was exposed, not a holding place. Whatever or whoever was being kept was behind the ledge, in the rock itself. She remembered that Crew had mentioned the cave systems in the north wall. She circled further, going higher, above the ledge line, crawling the last 30 feet on her hands and knees on bare rock. From above, she could see the ledge and the guard below her, and she could see what the guard was facing away from, a horizontal crack in the canyon wall, perhaps 4 feet high and 10 feet wide, dark inside, set back from the ledge by 20 feet of flat rock. A cave entrance, large enough for a person. She lay on the rim above and watched for 10 minutes. The guard did not move significantly. No one came or went from the cave. She climbed down the inside of the rim to a point where she was level with the cave entrance, and the guard was below her line of sight, and she crossed the flat rock on her stomach, moving in absolute silence on the bare stone, and she reached the cave entrance and looked inside. The cave went back perhaps 30 feet, widening slightly from the entrance. It smelled of old ash and animal occupation and something else, food recently cooked. At the back of the cave, on a bedroll on the stone floor, a man lay sleeping. He was older, 50, perhaps 55, with a gray beard and the sun-darkened skin of a man who had spent decades outdoors. His wrists were bound in front of him with a length of leather cord, loose enough that he had circulation and tight enough that untying the knot himself was not practical. His breathing was slow and regular. She put her hand on his shoulder and said his name quietly. Harlan Crew opened his eyes. He did not make a sound. He looked at her with the immediate alertness of a man who had been sleeping lightly in a dangerous place for a long time, and he took her in, a woman he had never seen before, appearing at the entrance to his cave in the early morning, and he said nothing, which told her that whatever had broken in him during 6 weeks of captivity, it was not his judgment. She showed him the journal. She said his nephew's name. She said they needed to move before the guard's rotation changed. He sat up slowly, his bound wrists moving together. She cut the cord with her skinning knife. He flexed his hands twice, then nodded. They went out of the cave in the same order they'd come in, her first, him behind, and both of them flat on the rock face crossing the exposed flat. The guard below on the ledge had not moved. They reached the rim and went over it, and she did not breathe properly until the ridge was between them and the ledge and the guard below. They came down from the north wall on the far side of the canyon, a route that took longer but kept them above the canyon floor and away from the main trails. Harlan Crew was in better physical condition than she had feared, thin and stiff from 6 weeks of limited movement, but capable and quiet and entirely focused on the task of distance, which was the right focus. He spoke in brief sentences as they moved. He filled in the gap between his journal's last entry and this morning in the practical, compressed way of a man who has processed a bad experience sufficiently to report it without being inside it. They had taken him at his camp, 5 men appearing before dawn, 2 of them from inside the cave before he was fully awake, so that there was no moment of possible resistance. They had not hurt him. They had told him, in terms that were civil and precise and left no ambiguity, that he would stay in the canyon until they had completed their business and that his continued good health depended on his continued cooperation with this arrangement. Their business, as he had pieced it together from what he observed and what was occasionally said within his hearing, was land. Specifically, a water claim on the upper canyon that was currently unregistered and that they intended to register under a name that was not their own, using documents that would be difficult to challenge once they were filed. The kind of arrangement that required secrecy for a specific window of time and made certain kinds of witnesses inconvenient. They need the canyon quiet for another 3 weeks, Crew said as they moved along the east wall above the creek bed. After that, the filing window closes and whatever they've done becomes significantly harder to undo. She thought about her letter of authorization, about the land company name on it, about what a field recorder for a land company represented to men who were quietly filing a fraudulent water claim on land the company was actively assessing. "They know what I am," she said. "They've known since the second day you were here," he said. "They've been trying to decide if you'd found enough to be a problem." "And? 3 days ago they decided you probably had." He paused on the rock. "I heard them talking about it. That's when I knew someone had to get out of this canyon." She thought about the boot prints at the edge of the camp, standing and watching in the night. The decision already made, the action not yet taken, the window between them measured in hours. "We have until midday," she said. They moved faster. They reached the camp at mid-morning. Elias was on his feet when they came down the slope, his rifle in his good hand, and the expression on his face when he saw his uncle come off the rock wall behind Nora was the expression of someone who had not entirely believed the thing they'd been hoping for was real until it arrived. The 2 men held each other briefly and said nothing, which was the right amount. She was already breaking camp. She did not explain the urgency. They could both read it in the pace of her hands, and they both helped in the ways they were able. Harlan was stronger than his nephew at the moment, the older man's body recovering quickly from the restoration of movement. They had the camp down in 15 minutes, and the mule loaded in 20. and she was putting out the fire's last embers with the last of her water when she heard the sound from the north end of the canyon. Horses, more than one, moving at a purposeful pace on the canyon floor. She looked at the two men. Harlan met her eyes and nodded once. He had heard it. They went up the east wall, not the high game trail that was too exposed from the canyon floor for the first 200 yards. They went straight up the rock face, climbing hard and fast, the mule coming with a stubbornness that became suddenly cooperative when Harlan took its lead rope and spoke to it in a low, continuous voice that the animal apparently found persuasive. They were 60 feet up the wall when 3 riders came around the south bend of the canyon floor below. The riders moved at a walk, looking at the creek bed, looking at the walls, looking for a camp that was no longer there and 3 people who were no longer on the floor. She pressed herself against the rock and did not move and watched them through a gap between 2 boulders. The riders stopped where the camp had been. One dismounted and crouched, reading the ground. He spent a long time looking at the extinguished fire ring and the scuff marks of their departure. He stood and looked up the east wall. She held herself completely still and watched him look. His eyes moved across the wall in sections, the same way her father had taught her to look at country, the same slow, systematic search. He was good at it. She could see that even from 60 feet above. His gaze moved up and left, and she tracked where he was looking, and it was moving toward the gap between the boulders, and she closed her eyes the last moment before his gaze arrived. A closed eye in a dark gap is less visible than an open one. She did not know how she knew this, but she knew it the way she knew the other things that had kept her alive in 3 years of working alone in country that didn't care whether she lived. The rider looked at the wall for 30 seconds. Then he looked back at the canyon floor. He said something to the other 2 in a voice too low for her to make out. One of the other riders turned his horse north. The dismounted man remounted. They moved off south, back the way they had come. She waited 5 more minutes before she moved. They came out of the canyon at the north end in the early afternoon, the light still strong, the land opening from the tight red walls into a broader valley of scrub grass and distant timber. The settlement was 2 days north, but the stage road was half a day north and east, and the stage road was enough. They walked. Harlan Crew walked next to the mule with one hand on its lead rope and his face turned into the open air of the broader country, and she understood without asking what that open air meant to a man who had spent 6 weeks in a cave. She did not intrude on it. Elias walked on the other side of her, his bound shoulder carried carefully, and after a mile of silence he said, "You went up there knowing they might already have made the decision." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She thought about this for a quarter mile of open ground. "Because the journal ended mid-sentence," she said finally, "and I've never been able to leave a thing unfinished." He looked at her. She kept walking. "Also," she said, "they'd been through my pack twice. I didn't like what that said about their intentions, and I decided I'd rather be in motion than in camp when they acted on them." "That's more practical," he said. "Most true things are," she said. They reached the stage road that evening and camped on its edge, not hiding, deliberately visible, in the kind of spot where a passing stage driver or freight wagon would see them at first light. She rebuilt the fire high. She made it a signal, which it was. A freight wagon came through at dawn and took them north for the price of an honest account of conditions on the canyon trail, which the driver recorded in his own log and seemed to consider fair payment. In the settlement, she sent 2 telegrams, one to the land company in Prescott, detailing the fraudulent claim and the specific filing window and the names she had gathered from Crew's account, and one to the territorial marshal's office, which was the same information arranged in a different order for a different purpose. Whether anything came of the telegrams was not something she was present for. She left the settlement the following morning on a remounted mule with a new survey assignment in a different part of the territory, and the canyon and the 5 men and the water claim became something that had happened and was now behind her, the way all things eventually become something that happened and are now behind you. She thought about it sometimes in the following months, not with the anxiety of reliving it, but with the particular attention she paid to things she had learned. She had learned that a voice calling from a ridge in this country might be the thing it appears to be, or it might be something else entirely, and the only way to know is to go toward it rather than away. She had learned that the preparation you make for yourself has a way of becoming the preparation you made for someone you hadn't met yet. She had learned that 6 weeks of captivity in a canyon could leave a man's body thin and his judgment intact, which said something about what a person is made of when you get down to the parts that matter. And she had learned, or confirmed because some part of her had always known it, that a letter unfinished, and a man unfound, and a decision unmade all carry the same particular weight, the weight of a thing not yet completed that follows you until you go back and finish it. In this country, the things you leave undone have a way of coming back to collect. She did not leave things undone.